I'm Gary Venner, CEO of IFA Acquisitions, and I'm joined by Anand Senior Tax Manager of Haines Watts, who are one of the top 15 chartered accountancy firms in the UK with over 50 local offices, where we continue our informative question and answer series on our YouTube channel to provide insights into helping buyers and sellers understand the benefits of using brokers for the purchase and sale of IFA businesses, and also from using accountants for sound tax planning advice. The title of the next video is coming up on the screen now.
So in a typical, you might tell me there's no such thing as a typical acquisition or sale process, but what are the sort of things that the vendor needs to be aware of, and how long does the process take?
So the process is really how long's a piece of string, and very often the buying and selling of a business is unhurried, I would say, and that's a good thing. For both the buyer and the seller. It gives the buyer and the seller good time to get to know each other and to fully understand the alignment. I think it's really important that there's an alignment of ethics and client values. That's really is so important. From an introduction, we would certainly, if you come to a broker like ourselves, we would discuss various acquirers that we believe would suit, and we would narrow that down to having a short list, and at that point is starting those introductions. There will be lots of questions, lots of meetings that normally would take place, and then you end up with an indicative offer. And once that indicative offer has been approved and agreed, then we would move to a heads of terms at that point. Generally, between initial introduction to heads of terms, I would say you'll tend to be looking around the 3 months stage.
Okay.
Of course, that's when starts the due diligence and starting the sales and purchase agreement, which will have more involvement in terms of solicitor involvement in checking that the clauses and the warranties are there, and that can easily take up to another month, 2 months at that stage. I think it's important that it is time bound, because I think it can go on forever else, and so it is really important for both parties to have a target date that when they do agree that.
Absolutely.
For share purchases, we need to factor in another weight, which would typically be the change of control through the FCA. 60 working days is their sort of service level agreement, which is typically 3 months, and it almost takes those 3 months to do it. So, again, factor that in. So 6 to 12 months is probably norm, and some do go beyond that as well. But it should. If everybody's pointing in the right direction, want this to happen, you should be able to still get this done. And we've actually done sales much quicker than even under 3 months. So it is there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, and I suppose it's important to let the vendor know that it's going to be in everyone's interest, I suppose, within reason, to, as you say, keep things time bound, and otherwise there's a risk of the acquirer potentially looking elsewhere.
Absolutely, and the quicker we can get into having contracts as well. I'm a great believer in having exchange of contracts and completion, because everybody knows where they are when the deal has actually been signed. Heads of terms are great, but they're often non-binding except for the exclusivity. But exchanging contracts, especially if you have FCA approval, which is really a tick box exercise for most businesses, is where I would say is to go down that route. That just gives clarity and certainty.
Okay. And during this process, what sort of levels can you give us an idea? What sort of levels of information requirement there are at the various stages, and how the vendor's confidentiality is protected during the process.
If I start with confidentiality, I would say first of all it's really important that when a vendor is talking with a broker is make sure that that broker has non-disclosure agreements already in place with the acquirer, so no details of their business is ever sent out without having NDAs in place. Certainly that's as from IFA Acquisitions point of view, it's always been very important that we do that, and we're a broker that don't want to send out their details to multiple acquirers. We can do the conversations with the sellers about which we believe suits the best, so we limit the number, and that just keeps everything nice and confidential. And certainly later on, when the two parties are talking directly and sharing information between them, that's when you would expect NDAs to be in place between those parties as well. In terms of what the information, it's really important that we're as open and transparent and have a really good understanding of the business. So a good broker will ask all of that information to create its own fact find of that business, and the areas that will be then covered under due diligence will be typically wanting to see, for instance, the quality of the advice. So files will need to be inspected, and usually they'll be done under a sample basis,
right.
And then that sample may increase if there's anything that's sort of flagged up. So do expect your files to make sure that the advice is good, because else that could be a problem further down the line. And even if it's just an asset purchase, reputational risk is a concern for some, that that you don't want any clients to start having complaints, even if they're going back to the old entity, etc. The other aspect will be accounting records. So most of these deals are going to be a multiple of either recurring income or EBITDA for larger businesses. So again, we need to validate those accounting records, so making sure they're always available and up to date is really important too. Client lists, really important. We normally would suggest that a vendor prepares a client list anonymised. We're not interested in the names. And location is important, so whether that's a postcode or it's the town, etc. That's what we need to know on there. But we would be typically looking at the dates of birth or age of those clients. We would look at the funds under management for each of those clients, and that would be broken down by product type and provider, and then obviously the recurring income attached to that as well. By looking at the plan type, it will throw up whether there are higher risk areas. We would expect there to be more due diligence around VCTs, EIS schemes, and DB transfers particularly, etc. And that list itself can be used as the working document, particularly for the acquirer to actually start to request those files, and particularly on higher value clients, to make sure that all areas of, let's say, inheritance, tax planning, etc. has been considered.
Yeah, as you say, paperwork is key here, and record keeping vital. So are there, what are the requirements there about being able to produce paperwork in terms of length of time that you need to have held certain items, and potentially actually what then are the attractions of having any of this on a sort of client management system?
Absolutely brilliant if there's a good client management system, and particularly the transferability of that data from system to system as well. So that's usually the best opportunity, and because most systems will of course have an electronic filing system there as well. So being able to request access to those documents, or using some kind of share facility in terms of being able to move those files over without having to physically go to offices, is going to be far better in that point. So client file agreements, again, compliance, if you have audits, what's the frequency of those audits? Let's have a look at those and making those available. So if you're a seller, just try to make as much comfort to the acquirer that
Excellent. And what would you say are the options available when like latent liabilities are found in the DD process? What options are available in contractual terms?
Well, again, it depends, of course, whether there's an asset or a share purchase and whether the liability exists there. There will inevitably be extra warranties put into contracts, usually to make sure that the seller takes some responsibility if complaints and redress come out shortly after the purchase has taken place. So you would often expect there to be some kind of personal guarantees in place, or an offset against the total consideration on the second, third, the payments through deferred payments. It's also important to look at whether there is run-off cover required, or it may be, certainly on a share purchase, that the vendor will cover the cost of any excesses and maybe premium increases because of those complaints that are upheld. So, expect there to be some additional warranties in the contract. And of course, one of the things that can happen under that due diligence, if something has shown up that is unhappy to the acquirer, may be that the sale is aborted. And of course, most heads of terms is non-binding other than the exclusivity. So that's something to be fearful of again. And what I would say to sellers is be open and honest from the beginning, because it can be frustrating and time consuming, plus there could be costs involved, certainly from the legal side of things, if a sale gets aborted. So be upfront about the files, etc.
Yeah, and I suppose with your experience in the industry and what your firm does, you're able to foresee these potential issues. As you say, one of your first steps is to get to yourself look at the vendor's business and determine and foresee what potential issues there might be, because it will help everyone in the long run and smooth the process when there is an acquirer.
I totally agree, Anand, and we sort of make sure that we say up front, we don't apologise for asking lots of questions. We really want to sort of drill right down into what this business looks like, because we want to know whether there is likely to be an issue further down the line. And let's address it at the beginning, because with our knowledge and understanding, and that's, I think, again where we would say is one of our USPs, is having the industry knowledge. I spent a lifetime in financial services, so I fully understand the advice processes, and so it's really important that we do analyse well, and that's good news for our acquirers, that they get that extra information, so that it helps them determine whether this business is for them or not.
Hi Gary, thanks for joining us here today. One of the questions we often get asked by our clients is what makes their business attractive, and is there something that they can do in preparation for a potential sale to make their business more attractive?
Sure, Anand. Well, I think first of all that most IFA businesses will be attractive to someone. Yeah, and that it may well be that it's a small business for sale, and there will be an ideal acquirer that is looking just to absorb a few extra clients, etc. So, coming to a broker like ourselves, you would expect us to have lots of acquirers, and we will know that we will be able to find a buyer for most, if not all, sellers. Universally, though, I would say what makes a business attractive, first of all, would be the level of funds under management.
Okay.
Now, whilst we do look after smaller, I would say certainly when an IFA has got at least 25-30 million, it's going to have wider appeal, and there will be some acquirers, particularly the larger consolidators, that are looking at higher volume of funds under management now. If we're starting to look at 100, 200, 300 million, again, it's going to have much more attraction as well. The other area would be the average holdings per household, and we tend to look at household rather than individual clients here, because it's how many fact finds need to, for servicing,
Right.
usually you would have the spouses, at the same time. So what sort of figure? I would say, at 250 to 300,000 is going to increase the attractiveness, and there will be some that will look higher value as well, particularly those that are trying to segment into the private wealth area. But 250 to 300,000 is a good average, which will have attractiveness there. Also will be the type of investments. Again, acquirers universally prefer platform-based. It's much easier to align with their own centralised investment proposition, as opposed to bonds, which can be more difficult to justify the transfer to a client, particularly if we're looking at charges alone, and comparing that. The other area will be the level of risk, particularly if an IFA has had higher risk areas, then it may reduce that attractiveness for some acquirers to be interested in that type of client bank. And notably, I suppose we're talking at the moment, the hot potato is the DB pension transfers. And I'd say another area would be the age of the vendor. The attractiveness for a retiring vendor is, it removes that concern from an acquirer that that individual will want to come back to advising or to setting up in business again. So, all of those aspects, I suppose, are going to make attractiveness to acquirers. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and switch on notifications so that you won't miss our next video in this series. We provide insight into the tax planning benefits for an exit or acquisition of financial advisory businesses, as well as the benefits of using brokers by two industry experts, me, Gary Venner, CEO of one of the UK's largest specialist brokers in IFA Acquisitions, and Anand Chandarana, Senior Tax Manager of Haines Watts, one of the UK's top 15 chartered accountancy firms.